Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid has filed a motion to limit debate on the $109 billion surface transportation bill. If no agreement is reached, the cloture vote would happen on Friday. Members of President Obama's cabinet continue to talk about their department's proposed 2013 budgets on Capitol Hill. Defense Secretary Panetta and Joint Chiefs of Staff Chairman Dempsey and Treasury Secretary Geithner explained their budget requests to lawmakers today. You can see their testimony on C-SPAN tonight after the House is out and at cspan.org right now. And there'll be more tomorrow. Energy Secretary Chu will be at the Senate Energy Committee, and House Budget Committee will hear from Treasury Secretary Tim Geithner. Secretary Chu at 9:30 a.m. Eastern Time and Secretary Geithner at 2 p.m. Both of those hearings will be on C-SPAN 3.
Madam President.
The senator from Indiana is recognized.
Madam President, I ask unanimous consent that the call of the quorum be vitiated.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I come to the floor today frustrated, as many of us are, that once again we're not able to address legislation in the way the Senate is designed to address, and that is to debate, to discuss, to offer amendments, to vote. Once again, the majority leader has decided that he didn't like the amendments that some of us were proposing, and therefore used a procedure which shuts off all opportunity to provide an amendment. We're allowed to come down and give our little speeches, but there's no debate. There's no back and forth. There's no record of where we stand on certain issues except for final passage. I think the American people want more than that. That's not why they sent us here. This is my second time in the Senate with a 12-year gap in between. And a lot of people ask me, what has changed since the first time? And I said, well, one thing that's dramatically changed, which didn't happen during my first 10 years in the Senate, was that we used to be able to essentially come to the floor and offer any amendment at any time to any bill. That's the difference between the Senate procedures and the House of Representatives. We don't have a Rules Committee that dictates which amendments can be offered and which ones can't. This is supposed to be a body where we have open discussion, where any member can offer any amendment to any bill at any time. And in my first 10 years, that's what we did. Now, it made for long nights, it made for long days, but we were performing a function that our founding fathers designed for us to fulfill. And somehow it worked out. And we went on record. Our yay was yay and our nay was nay, and it was there for the public to see. The amendments that were offered, the debate that took place, the vote that was conducted was there, and we had to go home and explain why we voted yes or why we voted no, and the public, it was full transparency. And today, and in this period of time, I've just been here a year and a month, in my second stint here in the Senate, it's very seldom when we have that opportunity. And once again, here on a highway bill that affects every American in every state, it's been expanded and extended a number of times, and we finally get to the real thing, and then our side puts up some amendments, and the majority looks at them and says, no, we don't want our members to have to vote on this, and so we're going to use a procedure called filling the tree. Now, that doesn't mean anything to Americans. Filling the tree, what are you talking about? There is a procedure here by which you can only offer so many amendments to a particular bill before you're precluded from offering another. And the majority leader of the Senate, whether it's Republican or Democrat, has the opportunity, if they want to take it, to gain the floor and procedurally put us in a position where no amendments can be offered, and then move to talking about it, but then move to immediate debate. This is not the way we ought to proceed. Well, I was prepared to give this highway bill a real chance. I had some real problems with the bill that is before us. The House is passing legislation that has many things in it that I like, some things that I don't like, and we were all looking for an opportunity to try to address those particular concerns that we had. I have a particular concern with the bill that is brought before the Senate, because this bill, for starters, goes into the general fund and beyond the sales tax for gasoline purchases fund. You know, everybody thinks that, you know, when they pull up to the pump and fill up their car with gas, they know there's the federal tax attached to the price that you pay. But they know that it goes into, quote, a gasoline, a tax fund specially designed to provide for construction and provide for return to the state so that they can build the roads and repair the bridges and do things associated with transportation. And that's why we pay that gas tax. And that's supposed to be apportioned in a rational way out back to the states so that they can do what is needed for their state to provide the kind of transportation that their state wants. This bill not only uses up all the money that's paid in to that fund, but adds an additional $12 billion of spending that's from the general fund, and the pay-fors, from my perspective, aren't legitimate. And so once again, we're in a situation where we're borrowing money, going into debt, increasing deficit spending and increasing the debt limit, the load that we have, in order to enhance the money that we're going to send out to the states. Many of us have basically said that based on what we have seen and has happened here in years, that has driven us into a deficit which cannot be sustained and in a debt which may never be repaid, that we're simply not going to support legislation that spends more without it being paid for, that spends more than we take in. We just simply can't keep doing this. And now we're in a situation where we have a bill before us that is needed because we need these funds to go to the states to build these roads and repair these bridges, but yet we are dipping into the general fund for an additional $12 billion. Secondly, there's an inequitable treatment here to states. And I bring this chart here to show just how this affects various states. If you take what a state has paid into the fund and look at what a state receives back, and you will see that there is an inequity present here, that part of the general fund money that's going into this might try to make up for some of that. But if we stay with the principle upon which highway funding has always been funded, and that is that a state, its return to it, its proportionate share of what its taxpayers pay when they pull up to the pump in that state and fill their car with gas, there are some states that fall in a real deep deficit. It starts with the state of Texas, and that's on top here, and Texas loses $1,137 million of money that is paid in but doesn't come back to them under the formula. My home state of Indiana, third on the list. We lose $275 million because what we pay into the fund is not returned to us. So these are all the donor states. Donor states are those that pay in more than they receive back. And they're pretty big states. And they have a real stake in this. And they would have had a real stake in this amendment. And they would have had an opportunity to vote for or against this amendment had I been allowed to offer it. So the states of Texas, Georgia, $283 million, New Jersey, Florida, California, Ohio, Virginia, Michigan, Illinois, on and on it goes. Members can take a look at this chart. This is the amount of money that they lose because they're not getting their fair share back. And so they're the donor states. And the money then that they lose is sent to other states that are the donee states. So our taxpayers in Indiana are paying equivalent of $283 million to other states. Now, we've been a state that has managed our fiscal situation very well. And we have been very careful with how, we have this old-fashioned belief that you shouldn't spend more money than you take in. And we live by that principle in Indiana. And so we've been careful in how we've managed our money and how we've used the money that is sent to us that we paid in to the gas tax fund. And yet we're penalized because we have managed our finances well, and our taxpayers end up sending money to states that haven't done so well. Now, the second problem here is that this bill falls short on the fact that earmarks that we no longer are doing, but yet those earmarks over the past several years where members have been able to direct a specific amount of money to a specific project within their state, so-called earmark, where the total of those earmarks go into the total average of spending for that particular state, and the formula then is based on the fact that the big earmarkers end up getting more money, while states like Indiana that have not pursued those earmarks lose out, because the average is based on the accumulative amount that is paid into the fund, including earmarks. So once again, a state that has been careful in terms of managing and spending its money ends up being penalized because we haven't pursued earmarks, which fortunately are no longer part of our method of doing business around here. Indiana pays approximately 2.71% of the total federal gas tax, and we'd like to get 2.71 of that back. And if we do get that back, it will have a significant effect. We have a second chart here that talks about what is paid into the Highway Trust Fund, just for a few states that we've listed, the apportionment under the bill that's before us, and the amount that is below the fair share. And I've read some of those. Again, Texas, Georgia, Indiana, New Jersey, and Florida being the top 5 states that are penalized for this. Madam Chairman, I also had amendments that I was going to add here that would give states greater flexibility in terms of how they use the money that they receive. We've all heard the stories about money being diverted to things that a state doesn't want because there's a formula attached to the legislation that says you've got to spend X percent of money on certain projects like bike paths and walking paths and other enhancements, the so-called enhancements. I'm not against that. I mean, I use those. I jog on bike paths and appreciate some of those enhancements. But that ought to be a state decision in terms of how it allocates its money and not a federal decision. Because a one-size-fits-all dictated by a particular piece of legislation simply does not take into the individual needs of a particular state. One state might decide to use it for a larger percentage for this, that, or something else. Other states may want to say, look, our roads are in such shape that and our bridges need repair. At least for this year or this next 2 years, we're going to divert the money into strictly construction and repair projects. Others might say, well, we're in a little bit better shape this year and we can use some of this. That ought to be for the state to decide and not a piece of legislation coming out of this body. Finally, another amendment that I would have liked to have been able to offer, if not for the majority leader's refusal for an open amendment process, is one that would have limited the scope of eligible transportation enhancement projects. I think we hear these reports every day about crumbling roads and unsafe bridges. And yet what we are doing in this bill is limiting how a state determines where it puts its funds. And so I think we ought to narrow that option, if not take it away, and so that's an amendment also that I was going to use. Madam President, to wrap up, let me just say I think it's very unfortunate, more than unfortunate, that we have resorted to a system here where if the other side, and I say this if we were in the majority, I would say this to my leader if my party was in the majority. This is not how the Senate is supposed to operate. Someone from the other side who has an amendment that we don't like, they ought to have the opportunity to offer that amendment. And they ought to have the opportunity to debate that amendment and to require a vote on that amendment. And then we can vote yes or we can vote no, and public can judge us accordingly. But to simply shut it all down and not give anybody that opportunity, I think, is not the kind of procedure that we want. And finally, let me just simply say that this bill brought before us is a flawed bill. And without the process of amending it, the opportunity to amend, to fix what we think is wrong with it, puts us in a position where it's impossible to say you can vote for something like this. And so for the reasons I've articulated and for other reasons that hope that will come out as we make these speeches on the floor but don't have a chance to offer amendments, I just simply cannot support this bill as it is. And I think I've probably exceeded my time, and with that, I yield back and note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka. Mr. Alexander.
The senator from Ohio.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to dispense with the quorum call.
The quorum call shall be dispensed with without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to S-Res 377 submitted earlier today.
Clerk will report.
SRS 377, recognizing the 50th anniversary of the historic achievement of John Herschel Glenn, Jr. in becoming the first United States astronaut to orbit the Earth.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion to reconsider be laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, and any statements be placed in the record as if read.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that a fellow in my office, Nicole Smith, be allowed to come to the floor for the remainder of the day.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. On behalf of Senator Portman and myself, I'm proud to have introduced this bipartisan resolution joined by 18 senators, 10 of whom served with Senator John Glenn in this institution, the United States Senate. 50 years ago next week, on the morning of February 20th, 1962, John Herschel Glenn of Ohio became the first American to orbit the Earth. I was 9 years old, the presiding officer even younger than that. Like other families around Ohio, I watched him on television at home in Mansfield, a city not much different from where John Glenn grew up, sitting with my parents and my two older brothers. The broadcast, I remember, showed John Glenn Sr. and Clara Glenn, John's parents, watching anxiously from their small-town Ohio home. Across the country, others were listening on transistor radios. In New York City, the subway system broadcast the liftoff and flight progress over loudspeakers. In Grand Central Station, CBS News set up a 12-foot by 16-foot screen over the main ticket window. By the time of liftoff, 10,000 people were standing and watching. Like millions of Americans, they watched and listened to Walter Cronkite set the scene. Our nation was in the midst of the Cold War, worried about Russian nuclear aggression, worried about the space race. Cronkite later said, quote, "It was a time when the intricacies of science were complicated by deep American doubts and anxieties over where we stood in the race with Russian science. With the arms race in a dead heat, space had become the scoreboard of Cold War competition." That's why a few years earlier, President Eisenhower launched Project Mercury as the first human spaceflight program in the United States to put our country on the playing field. Hundreds of our nation's bravest and patriotic aviators signed up. Only 7 were selected in the original Mercury 7. John Glenn of Ohio, M. Scott Carpenter of Colorado, Gordon Cooper Jr. of Oklahoma, Virgil Gus Grissom of Indiana, Walter Schirra of New Jersey, Alan Shepard of New Hampshire, and Donald Deke Slayton of Wisconsin. John Glenn later wrote of the original astronauts, "The world was at the door of a new age. We were the people who had been chosen to make the first steps across the threshold." When President Kennedy took office, he continued our nation's pursuit into space and race against the Russians. He said, "Our leadership in science and industry, our hopes for peace and security require us to solve these mysteries and to solve them for the good of all humankind." Alan Shepard piloted the Freedom 7 in May 1961 in the first space shot. Gus Grissom joined piloted Liberty Bell 7 in July 1961 to prove that Americans could launch humans into suborbital flight. But then the Russians successfully launched Yuri Gagarin into orbit around the Earth. America's response was left to a decorated Marine aviator born in Cambridge, Ohio, who grew up a few miles away in New Concord. On the morning of February 20th, 50 years ago this week, the eyes of the world were on John Glenn, who was tasked with piloting our space program's most dangerous flight at the time. He commanded Friendship 7, named by Glenn and his children David and Len, to emphasize our nation's intentions in space. Over weeks and months, his mission was scrubbed 10 different times. Twice he was actually on the Atlas missile in Friendship 7 when the launch was postponed. The reasons were varied, from inclement weather to technical problems. Tensions remained high throughout. Any miscues or failure would undermine national security, along with national pride in the country's psyche. Finally, at 9:47 a.m. on February 20th, 1962, 70-degree Fahrenheit weather at NASA Space Center in Cape Canaveral, Friendship 7 blasted off into space. As the rocket ascended, people cheered, others cried, others prayed. The hopes of an entire nation rested on the shoulders of this Ohio astronaut in a space capsule hurling into an unknown place. He seemed not to know fear. The mission went forward. Everything was going as planned from launch to orbital entry, and once successfully in space, John Glenn became the first American to orbit the Earth. He would observe 3 sunrises, 3 sunsets in the wonder of the universe in only 4 hours and 56 minutes. During the flight, problems occurred. The spacecraft's automatic control system malfunctioned, causing Glenn to manually control the capsule, and he was prepared to do so. Benefiting from NASA's vigorous training that included 70 simulated missions and malfunction response training for nearly 200 simulated system failures. His model of calmness, which I've seen many times over the years in all kinds of situations, and his wherewithal would become standard operating procedure for future NASA manned space missions. Despite having to deal with the malfunctions, John Glenn still carried out crucial parts of the mission. He took photographs of the Earth. He observed weather on the Earth's surface. He gave constant feedback to flight controllers about his physical responses to the zero-gravity environment. Earlier in the flight, John saw an indicator light that Friendship 7's heat shield had loosened, threatening his reentry into Earth. With its world-class scientists and engineers leading the way, and confident in its flight planning, NASA decided to keep the retro rocket pack attached to secure the heat shield. As planned, Friendship 7 re-entered the Earth's atmosphere, with Glenn describing the fireball re-entry as one of the most exhilarating parts of the flight. It's the streak of light that people on Earth could see in the sky, and in descent, the capsule successfully parachuted and splashed down in the Atlantic Ocean east of the Grand Turk Island at 2:43 p.m. Eastern Time. The USS Noah retrieved Friendship 7 and brought Glenn aboard, validating our nation's pursuit of discovery, ensuring its place in the space race against the Russians. And just as important, the flight of Friendship 7 and the courage of John Glenn inspired generations of new scientists and engineers and aviators. It launched a new era of space, aerospace, and defense industries. It showed that our advancements in science and in exploring the unknown are not only a national security imperative, they're an economic imperative too, reaffirming that we have what it takes to outcompete and out-innovate any nation in the world. After his flight, John Glenn, of course, received a hero's welcome, decorated with awards and accolades and honored in ticker tape parades and magazine profiles. Throughout all of it, he remained humbled by his patriotism and, of course, his small-town Ohio roots. As a son whose father was a plumber and whose mother was a school teacher, he remained grounded by his love for his wife, his childhood sweetheart, Annie. Much has been written about Annie and John Glenn. Both are just as in love with each other now in their 90s as they were as children when they met, as John said, in a playpen in New Concord. He says of Annie that she was part of my life from the time of my first memory. It's fitting that in celebrating the 50th anniversary, we honor his family, Annie and their children, David and Lynn, who gave public blessing and private prayers in support during his service to our nation. I was fortunate to sit with Lynn and David and Annie in the rotunda when John Glenn, with 3 other astronauts, received the Congressional Gold Medal for his flight aboard Friendship 7. We also honor the thousands of dedicated and patriotic men and women of NASA's Project Mercury program. It took a huge team of people as dedicated as John Glenn and perhaps as courageous, who ensured the safety and security of its astronauts and preserved the pride of a grateful nation. John will be in Florida on this weekend to meet with those who were part of that operation, the engineers, the scientists, the technicians, and thanking them again for sending him up and bringing him down safely. Their service has inspired generations of future NASA technicians and mission control specialists from Plum Brook Station in Sandusky to NASA Glenn in Cleveland to NASA centers around the country. At one of the first press conferences of the Mercury 7 astronauts, John Glenn said, "This whole project stands with us now like the Wright brothers, Ohioans also, stood at Kitty Hawk. I think we stand on the verge of something as big and as expansive as that was 50 years ago." It's that spirit of discovery, that conviction, duty and faith that John Glenn embodies and that his flight aboard Friendship 7 symbolizes. It's my honor to introduce this bipartisan resolution celebrating such an important national and scientific achievement. It's also my honor to be accompanied on the floor today by Nicole Smith, who is a fellow from NASA Glenn, an aeronautical engineer who has done things as varied as trained cosmonauts to the work she's done in our office guiding the success of NASA Glenn, one of the best NASA centers in the country, and also joined on the floor with Laura Lynch, who has been with my office for 3 years, a Clevelander who is actually leaving our office for bigger and better things in a couple of weeks, and she has been part of this too. And my last personal moment with this resolution is I remember 40-some years ago, 44 years ago, I believe, Mr. President, when John Glenn was not Senator Glenn, but still Colonel Glenn, and I had received my Eagle Scout Award in Mansfield earlier in the year, and Colonel John Glenn came to a dinner with a number of other Eagle Scouts in Mansfield, and I have a picture in my office in the Senate Hart building of me standing there in my Boy Scout uniform with my Eagle pen with John Glenn, and next to that is a picture of John Glenn and me some 38 years later before he walked me down the center aisle to be sworn into the United States Senate with my colleague from Rhode Island in January of 2007. So John Glenn is special to our nation. He's special to my wife Connie and me because of our love for John and Annie both and our respect for David and Lynn, their children, and he has honored our country in so many ways, and it's my honor to submit this resolution and thank my colleagues. Mr. President, I yield the floor and suggest the absence of a quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Earlier today, senators approved a judicial nomination for the Federal Appeals Court in Atlanta. And in about an hour from now, at 6:30 Eastern, the chamber will begin up to 30 hours of debate on surface transportation programs. Earlier today, Senate Republicans took to the floor to talk about President Obama's fiscal 2013 budget proposal. We'll hear first from former White House Budget Director and current Ohio Senator Rob Portman.
And as you know, this week was the week that the President sent his budget to Congress, as happens every year. The budget is a document that determines what the spending will be and the revenues will be, not just for the next fiscal year, but for a 10-year period. So it's really a document about what the direction of our country ought to be. It's a vision for the country, if you will. And it's being sent to the United States Congress at a time when we face extraordinary fiscal challenges. We have a record debt of over $15 trillion. We have deficits that have been over $1 trillion a year for the last several years, and it looks like this year, once again, will be well over $1 trillion. In comparison to previous years, we have a debt that's now as large as our entire economy, which is larger than any time since World War II. In fact, as a country, we are spending more money at the federal level than we ever have before. As a percent of GDP, more than we ever have since World War II. So these are times when we have a true fiscal crisis at our doorstep, and we need to handle it. We are borrowing over 40 cents of every dollar that's spent at the federal level. In that context, I got to tell you, I'm very disappointed in the budget proposal that was sent to us because it's simply not up to the challenge that we face. It taxes too much, it borrows too much, and it spends too much. And unfortunately, it adds another $11 trillion to the national debt over this 10-year period. Again, a debt that already tops 100% of our country's economy. It does nothing to change the fact that Social Security and Medicare are in trouble. Very important programs, of course, but by not addressing them in this budget document, it means that what everybody knows is that unless we do something, they will head toward insolvency. This continues to be the case. Remarkably, I thought the President proposes another $350 billion in a so-called stimulus bill within this budget. And pays for it how? Well, either in red ink with more borrowing or by raising taxes. It actually raises taxes by nearly $2 trillion over this 10-year period. And this is despite the fact that the Congressional Budget Office has told us that by raising taxes, we're going to hurt the economy. In fact, result in higher unemployment next year than this year. We all know that the long-term drivers of these deficits is entitlement spending. These important programs, Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, along with interest on the debt, is called the mandatory spending part of the budget. That's now a bigger and bigger part of the budget and the fastest growing part of the budget. It's 64% of the budget this year. Under what the President has proposed for the next 10 years, that mandatory spending, which means it's not subject to annual appropriations by Congress, again, important programs, but not on a sustainable path, this mandatory spending will grow from 64% of the budget, where it is today, which has grown and grown over the years, to 78% of the budget in 10 years, under the budget proposal the President has put forward. Republican, Democrat, Independent alike, we know that this is not sustainable. It's not sustainable, and unfortunately, it's going to hurt these programs in a way that is going to make it very difficult for our seniors and others who rely on them. Overall, the President's promised deficit reduction also doesn't look like it works. The budget claims $5.3 trillion in deficit reduction over the next decade. However, if you look at it,